At the same time? Yeah.
I was just thinking.
Yeah, I think it's the same one.
Okay, yeah, whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon. So welcome to the Race and Public Space Working Group. I'm the director, Michael Rao. The Race and Public Space Working Group is sponsored by the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. Today is our latest program in the Reparations Project. Today's talk features Jovan Lewis, a professor of geography and African American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Jovan also serves as the co-chair of the Economic Disparities Research Cluster at Berkeley's Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. Jovan Lewis received his PhD in anthropology from the London School of Economics. His research is broadly concerned with the concepts of market, capital, poverty, and race, and post-coloniality, which he examines through the raced experiences of the economy and of economic and social practices. Jovan's current research considers the function of capital value and reciprocity through the Jamaican lottery scam, which we'll be discussing today, a money transfer scheme that targets white North Americans. And Jovan is using this Jamaican lottery scam to think about relations of capital and race, blackness, in the overlapping wakes of colonial independence and structural adjustment. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jovan Lewis. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you to everybody for joining us today during the lunch hour. Michael, thanks for having me. Maya, Sierra, thank you for helping me get here and to be here in utmost of comfort and enjoyment. And of course, thank you to NYU and IPK for putting on what is, I think, a very important program, right? Which is the Reparations Project and the Race and Public Space program. So as Michael said, my interests are squarely aligned with questions of race experiences of the economy in the Caribbean broadly, but in particular in Jamaica. And I think about these areas of inquiry through what are kind of long-term ethical arrangements brought about through the varied experiences, historical experiences of Caribbean subjects from emancipation straight through to what I like to call the current wake of structural adjustment. So one way in which I do this is by thinking through the Jamaican lottery scam, right? Which I'll go into detail, of course, but just briefly, around 2007, this lottery scam emerged in the area of Montego Bay, in the outskirts of Montego Bay, in fact, and functions primarily through scamming predominantly white North Americans, often elderly people, out of quite a bit of money. And so the question of reparations comes up in the fact that when speaking with these scammers about the practice, reparations is the primary rationalization that they use to justify the practice. And so it's within that kind of really peculiar, fascinating kind of claim that I try to think more about what are the broader questions of reparations in Jamaica, as articulated by poor Black people. All right. So again, thank you for having me. I will be reading this. All right. So hopefully, I don't know, I do okay. All right. For the urban poor in Jamaica, poverty is an immutable state of economic precariousness or sufferation. Positioned as being ontologically incapable of progress, sufferation functions as a comprehensive site, enabling simultaneous registers of inhabitants. Across its varied experience, that inhabitants materializes through multiple organizing and reconciliatory articulations and ethical moral framings. This paper is concerned with the response to poverty as demonstrated through the practice of Jamaican lottery scamming, which is a money transfer scheme that deceives Americans through phone solicitation into wiring large sums of money to Jamaica through financial service companies such as Western Union and MoneyGram. The scam is seen as a form of reparations for the long histories and circuits of colonial and post-colonial inequality. Reparations in this paper will be explored through the logic of seizure, where scammers reformulate sites of transgression and modes of repayment. Doing so asks us to reconsider the concept of reparations in the Caribbean, revealing it to serve as more than a means of recompense refused by one party and expected by the other. Instead, reparations become an engagement that defines the continued productivity of post-colonial relations where transgression and transaction proffer novel forms of reciprocity. So best friends Dwayne, Omar, and Junior comprise a crew of scammers in the study, with other individuals participating intermittently or serving supporting roles. Junior, who started scamming first in 2008, was the crew's leader. Each member of the crew had gone through the Jamaican public school system, with some having finished their high school O-levels and others dropping out beforehand. They had each been variably involved in one occupation or another, but mostly casual labor. Every member of the crew lived as his family, the exception being Junior, who had children with his girlfriend and so lived between his family home and that of his partners. The group lived in the same housing development scheme of Elizabeth Commons pictured here, which built as low-income housing through the Urban Development Corporation in the late 1980s, is one of the more celebrated housing accomplishments in St. James Parish. Their neighborhood was a mixed community of the unemployed and the working poor. Though the crew considered their scheme to be impoverished, one could see aspiration across the entire community, as noted in conversations with residents and metaphorically evidenced by the remaining steel reinforcing rods or rebar that left uncut through first-story roofs reached upward in anticipation of the second story's eventual addition. And so those of you who know the third world, we know that you see these first floor housing with the metal rods left up, right? And that's not for a lack of cutting them, but actually it's a representation of ambition that the second story will eventually be added. It was the same figurative confluence of poverty and aspiration that served as an immaterial motivation behind the scam, but materially the crew was after the wealth represented by their potential victims. Attaining that wealth began with acquiring data. The crew, like all scamming operations, got victim information in the form of lead lists, sold by brokers working between Jamaica and the United States. These lists contained the names, contact details, and other personal information of potential victims, and sold for as much as $5 US per name. Lead list brokers compile the data by sending out bogus mass mailings purporting to be sweepstakes entries. Some lists, however, draw from access legitimate sweepstakes and raffle entries at casinos and customer data from retail operations. So if you're ever at the mall and you see that Jaguar in the middle and it says sign up here, don't do it. You won't get a Jaguar, but you might get scammed. Once victim data is acquired, everyone in the crew did one of two jobs: phone work or money collection. Collecting the money carried the most risk, as by the time of my fieldwork in 2011, scamming had already become well publicized since the practice's beginnings on the outskirts of St. James Parish in 2007. Money transfer companies had become increasingly suspicious of multiple transactions or transactions in particular amounts. Therefore, the money collector had to be willing to travel between branches and also have a personal profile that would not raise suspicion. For this reason, the primary money collector in the crew, Dwayne, had an official job in that he had an employee ID from a position that he once held. Omar and Junior did collections when the volume of transfers picked up, or when they determined that Dwayne might have frequented a particular branch too often, or the crew would dispatch its supporting members. Over time, as money collection became difficult due to increased protective measures being implemented by transfer companies, the crew and scammers on the whole came up with increasingly clever means to collect money. One method was having victims deposit funds directly to Green Dot Money Pack prepaid debit cards online. These are the cards that you see like in a Walgreens or a CVS, right? However, these alternative methods never entirely supplanted the direct collection of funds from money transfer branches. So Lotto scams, as their name suggests, are presented as if the victims have won a prize in the form of money, a car, or a combination of awards. And so here we have the Wall Street Journal very helpfully putting together an infographic representation of how the scam conventionally works. So we have here, in the top left quarter, the scammer phones the victims, getting the name and number from a contact list. Here, the scammer is saying, it looks like he's in an office. Right? Scammers don't scam from an office. They usually like living rooms, etc. Sorry, is that like Eames chair? I don't know. Anyway, it's great news. You have won $2.5 million and a car in a lottery. And this poor elderly woman relaxing there near her plant says, I didn't enter a foreign lottery. Scammer responds, you probably were entered automatically at a store. What color car do you want? Oh, there are a few small fees, right? Go down, she's at her CVS, right? I need to buy a payment card to send money, right? Here, the victim becomes frantic as scammers phone repeatedly, escalating demands and impersonating government officials. And 5, here, the final step is after the victim sends thousands of dollars, family members often step in, they freeze bank accounts and cut phone service, right? And this is a very rapid depiction of how this thing happens. And oftentimes this is not exactly what happens, but let's talk a bit more about some of the other scenarios, right, of how scamming comes to function, at least based upon the work that I do with the crew. Okay, so scammers tell their victims that their names are randomly drawn from a national registry. Interestingly, the long-running rewards program Publishers Clearinghouse is invoked as a familiar reference to give the unexpected winning a sense of plausibility. For millennials in the room, Publisher Clearinghouse is, I won't explain it, but Google it, right? For victims to receive their lottery prize, they are asked to pay taxes and transfer fees. These fees inevitably increase, leading victims to pay in the thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars. The premise of Junior and Crew's scam diverted significantly from this model, however. As in their scam, they notify their targets of having been owed a sum of money by a representative from the US Commission. The Commission, rather sophisticatedly, informs victims who are referred to as clients that there were errors in the calculation of their credit APR and that they are eligible for a reimbursement for overpayment. However, to receive the payment, as with other variations of the scam, they have to pay processing fees. The trick here is that these charges are themselves subject to interest compounding, making for difficult amortization and thereby prolonging the duration and profitability of the scam. There was a belief among the group that the scam was the most viable and profitable means of gaining real wealth and advancement, especially when compared with the limited means, of alternative opportunity. As Junior put it, you have to max out your own thing because nobody's going to look out for you. You can be here and dead for hunger like a dog. What are you going to do? You have to survive. That is the game. Survival is the game. Dwayne, concurring, added, man has to survive right now. At the end of the day, nobody has any money, and it's the same survival for them. I've worked it out already that I need to take what I want and need because nobody's going to give it to you. Underneath that argument lies a critique of local development processes, and in particular, their failure. As sufferers, the crew are acutely aware of their limited importance to the state. They, like many Jamaicans, have failed to realize the economic justice and social equity envisioned at Jamaica's independence. Popular political narratives following independence promoted, to quote Deborah Thomas, a common ideal vision of general social equality of a nation in which the Black majority would have greater access to state power and education, as well as greater control over economic resources. The promise of that vision is what Jamaicans would hope to see reflected in the government's support for them in the market, where they could compete equally and equitably. The history of development on the island tells a story of the failed delivery of that promise, as contemporary economic circumstances have done much to erode the sovereignties gained through decolonization and independence. And so it is unlikely that the independence vision could ever be brought to fruition by a government burdened by debt and made sclerotic by the rigidity of structural adjustment and other neoliberal mechanisms of governance. Scamming then is a product of the structural adjustment policies that have in many ways brought Jamaican development not much further than it was at independence, yet left further retrogressed by the expending of independence-era optimism and hope. Scammers therefore have as their only resource the openings made available in this landscape. Many scammers like Junior's crew therefore enter the practice citing the lack of legitimate opportunity in Jamaica and the negligible returns on any that are available. To them, Jamaica is full of potential yet restricted opportunity that is somehow just out of reach. they have decided not to accept those circumstances and have thus taken what they find as necessary, albeit illegal, steps to circumvent them. They refute the structures of exclusion and difference of an unstable economic environment caused by structural adjustment and seize wealth, to quote Janet Reutman, as a means of making claims to appropriate conditions for wealth creation, which has increasingly been read through a rationale of reparations. Public discourse around reparations had been gaining increased purchase in the Caribbean for several years when in 2013, the CARICOM Reparations Commission was established. CARICOM, which is the acronym for the Caribbean Community, is a multi-state organization promoting economic integration and cooperation among the member states of Antigua and Barbuda, the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, Haiti, Jamaica, Montserrat, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. The CRC emerged out of the 34th regular meeting of the Conference of Heads of Government of CARICOM in July 2013 in Trinidad. Renowned Barbadian scholar of economic history, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, published a 2013 text, Britain's Black Debt, Reparations for Caribbean Slavery and Native Genocide, which proved to be influential enough to inspire a proposal at that year's meeting to begin a program of inquiry into the case for reparations against the United Kingdom, sponsored by the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Ralph Gonsalves. The CRC, chaired by Professor Beckles, quickly established national reparations committees across the member states' nations. Within a year, on July 16, 2014, the CRC presented its case to the House of Commons in the Parliament of Great Britain. Beckles opened his speech with the following: I speak this evening in this honorable chamber of the House of Commons as chairman of the CARICOM Commissions on Reparations. My colleagues of the Commission are tasked with the preparation and presentation of the evidentiary basis for contemporary truth, that the government of Great Britain and other European states that were the beneficiaries of enrichment from the enslavement of African peoples, the genocide of indigenous communities, and the deceptive breach of contract and trust in respect of Indians and other Asians brought to the plantations under indenture, have a case to answer in respect of reparatory justice. The CRC campaign asserts that European governments were owners and traders of enslaved Africans, right, instructed genocidal actions upon indigenous communities, created the legal, financial, and fiscal policies necessary for the enslavement of Africans, defined and enforced African enslavement and native genocide as in their national interest, refused compensation to the enslaved with the ending of their enslavement, compensated slave owners at emancipation for the loss of legal property rights in enslaved Africans, imposed a further 100 years of racial apartheid upon the emancipated, imposed for another 100 years policies designed to perpetuate suffering upon the emancipated and survivors of genocide, and have refused to acknowledge such crimes or to compensate victims and their descendants. The demanded responses to the charges are offered in the CRC's 10-point plan for reparatory justice from former colonial powers, known as the CARICOM Reparations Justice Program. The program requests a full formal apology, repatriation support where sought, Indigenous Peoples Development Program, cultural institutions development, the addressing of public health crises, the eradication of illiteracy, the development of an African Knowledge Program, psychological rehabilitation, a technology transfer program, and debt cancellation. The demands of the mission and the claims of the CRC appear seemingly only entertained, if not entirely disregarded, if we view the statements of former UK Prime Minister David Cameron in 2015, 1 year after Beckles' visit to Parliament. Prime Minister Cameron, minimizing his country's responsibility for slavery reparations, announced regional development funding for infrastructure in the amount of £300 million, while imploring Jamaica, along with Britain, to, quote, move on from slavery's painful legacy. He also announced additional £25 million in British aid for prison construction in Jamaica specifically, so that the country's nationals serving sentences in the United Kingdom could be increasingly deported to carry out their prison terms on the island. This is what reparations look like to Great Britain. The prison offer was eventually rejected by Jamaican Prime Minister Andrew Holness over the concern that his government would be responsible for funding 60% of the ultimate cost of construction and operation of the prison. In the same year, the former president of France, François Hollande, similarly deflected Haitian calls for reparations by offering financial support through assistance in modernizing Haiti's education system and other forms of investment instead of a formal reimbursement. Reparations as figured by the CRC function as a quantification of redress, which renders restitution as an accounting of the accumulated injustices for which appropriate former colonial powers are responsible. Reparations thought of this way leaves open the questions of if reparations are owed, and if so, what form should they take and in what amount. The CRC's platform identifies the forms in calls for remedying chronic social problems and demands for structural investment in areas of development that for the organization would go some distance in making whole the Black communities of the Caribbean. One could make the argument, however, that what the CRC endeavored toward is a program of macroeconomic reparations through a comprehensive development program that avoids individual needs for reparative justice, in fact. In their program, the most radical demand is the nation-to-nation debt amnesty or debt cancellation. Debt here has a potent value because it both contains the qualification of the crimes of slavery's recognition and serves as a quantification for its repayment. It is debt ultimately that ties together the formerly colonized and their former colonizers in an arrangement of post-colonial relations. Thinking with debt allows for the tracing of what Ann Stoler has called the fact of living both colonial relations that are alive and well and post-colonial predicaments at the same time, to emphasize a colonial presence in its tangible and intangible forms, and to acknowledge that there are colonial presents. Right? Debt's ability to maintain such a relationship is made possible through the working of transactional reciprocity. Reciprocity remains an exchange practice that produces social relations of obligation. It is within those relations of reciprocal obligation that groups seeking repair and the parties from which they seek it are situated. Considering a reciprocal relationship produced from the crime of transatlantic slavery requires some rethinking of the way reciprocity works as a transaction. The notion of reciprocity, as extensively debated in the anthropology of exchange literature, is founded upon an initial act of giving, which followed by receiving requires a reciprocal giving, producing and deepening social relations as a process is repeated. However, within the context of slavery, the receipt of the free, although not freely given, labor of enslaved Africans would seemingly disqualify there being an initial act of giving, instead highlighting the vicious receipt of taking. Rather than accepting that disqualification, I am prompted to question whether there can be a gift derived from theft. I would argue that yes, there can be, when we consider that the violent coercion of Black labor would go on to produce industries, economies, and multitudinous global systems alongside, of course, the torture, death, and sorrow that accompanying them produce Black subjectivities made perpetually available for repeated exploitation across generations. Sadly, a gift that keeps on giving, as it were. The theft of Black life and the inequalities that have followed does not fully qualify as an engagement in reciprocal relations, and perhaps only satisfactorily serves as an unjust act that demands restitution. However, returning to Beckel's contemporary truth, where he asserts that Great Britain and other European states were the, quote, beneficiaries of enrichment from the enslavement of African peoples, end quote, it is the productive outcome of the taking that Black people in the West recognize as their deed of giving, and it is on that basis that they seek recompense. In this way, reparations claims speak to the gifting of Western benefits by Black subjects, thereby turning a Western white taking into a Black giving. This move, following an argument made by Pavanelli that reparations is a mode of compensation that implies, quote, a moment of consent, further places the formerly colonized into a relationship of reciprocity with their former colonizers, making possible the continued existence of a post-colonial relationship that is maintained by the anticipated repayment of debt. Centuries of waiting for colonial remediation has meant then that the contemporary reparations claims in the Caribbean are part of the long memory of injustice that sits in the hearts and minds of Black Caribbeans. the memory of those injustices and the debt that it produces has failed to fade away due to the memorializing cultural practices of these once enslaved and formerly colonized societies. However, more importantly, recollection is a result of the continued presence of involvement of those former colonizing nations as they endeavor to maintain the relationship of benefits. However, from the vantage point of former colonizers, the statute of limitations has been reached, making any formal repayment or even proper apology seemingly unnecessary. As such, only, quote, moral debts are recognized, while financial accounts are kept in arrears by assertions like Francois Hollande's in Haiti in 2015, saying, quote, we cannot change the past, but we can change the future. In fact, recalling the earlier discussion of his and Cameron's respective development programs, the governments of these nations might also argue that they have done much since slavery to contribute to their formerly colonized territories. In Jamaica, perhaps those contributions can be counted among the activities that include emancipation itself in 1834, whose offering demanded, right, the continued giving of Black labor through post-emancipation apprenticeship. Quote, full free or absolute abolition a few years later in 1838 guaranteed for the British the re-giving of 124 years of productive returns under colonial rule. Independence in 1962 quickly gave way by the late 1970s to the post-colonial procedures of structural adjustment programs and their tools of privatization, austerity, and lopsided trade deals. Again, debtors saw increased returns as they offered rescue packages of debt restructuring through foreign corporations' establishment of businesses in the industries of tourism and business processing outsourcing that extended very few benefits to Black and poor Jamaicans. Let us not also forget to count Cameron's offer to build a Jamaican prison, which is perhaps an expected deportation-flavored conclusion to a migratory pattern that brought surplus labor to British shores for decades. To be sure, proper accountancy across this 300-year period includes the significant costs paid by Jamaicans in their efforts to gain these, quote, advancements. After all, emancipation was earned through generations of sacrifice and suffering on their part. The process I have briefly recounted could easily be construed as an amortization of colonial debt. My purpose in highlighting these leaps of activity across centuries is to illustrate acts of giving, receiving, and re-giving through what Mary Douglas called the reciprocal catalog of transfers that make up society. Doing so calls upon Maurice Bloch and Johnny Parry's often cited idea of transactional order to show that post-coloniality is a long-term cycle of commitment bound up in relations of morality that enables the reproduction of the social and cosmic order. This demonstration of the residuals of injustice shows that the primary mechanism by and the extent to which reciprocal relations are defined, and that through which the post-colonial social and cosmic order is produced is through the work of deferral. As the literature on the anthropology of exchange has shown, delays in reciprocating transactions are critical to relationships of patronage and debt and the establishing or dismantling of hierarchies. The reparative debt owed to Black Jamaicans is unlikely ever to be materially settled in any meaningful or reasonable way if we take as an indication European governments' rhetorical framing of their responsibility as simply a matter of moral accountability. The non-payment keeps the post-colonial relationship viable by breaking the initial fiduciary promise of emancipation. And Stoller's writing on imperial formations is instructive on this point by urging us to reckon with the logic of unfinished projects within colonial domination and the gradual process of earned sovereignty. She writes that imperial formations are states of deferral that mete out promissory notes that are not exceptions to their operation, but constitutive of them. Delinquency through deferral, then, is the operational mode of imperial domination, where credit is issued by the dominated. However, Caribbean nations lacking geopolitical wherewithal and import are only capable of making reparative claims, but without guarantees. As a result, they suffer this detrimental delinquency, with the only gain being the moral political stability of their claim. To maintain any hope of reparations, they must remain tolerant of their accused enduring deferral. Relations of power are therefore manifest in the open-ended or ambiguous and unspecified terms of the promissory's arrangement. Life lived within a deferral of reparations for slavery is an experience of the material and structural deficiencies of post-colonial Caribbean society, which have produced subjectivities that have likewise taken on the character and pronounced sensibilities of deferral. The experience can be understood as being situated within the long emancipation, to borrow from Ronaldo Walcott's accounting for the current moments of Blackness as still existing, quote, within the time of emancipation, and that freedom, which is extra emancipation, or in other words, beyond the logic of emancipation, is still yet to come, end quote. The withheld recognition for the crime of slavery, which if fully recognized, would signal culpability and come with a compensatory obligation, renders Caribbean nations and their citizens in geographies of suspension or incomplete liberations, under-realized independences, and in an immutable state of economic precariousness. In such a landscape, accompanying hardship are relations, practices, and vocabularies that, particularized through race, produce a social and economic topography that is uneven and unequal. For poor Jamaicans, this experience of deferral constitutes the framing of sufferation, which is a social condition characterized by an inability for economic progress despite one's ambition, materially maintained through abiding foreign indebtedness, economic stagnation, and deficient development. Sufferation is thus a state of prolonged suspension, in which one endures conditions of inequality in watchful anticipation. Sufferation is the modality of deferral, which, producing a state of poverty, is the lived outcome of the promissory note never intended to be fulfilled. Again, the open-ended quality of the debt owed enables the manipulation of impoverished Caribbean subjects who, enduring in sufferation, anticipate the completion of their emancipation through reparations. Deferral mobilize as a post-colonial strategy of domination produces a one-sided form of reciprocity that benefits former colonizers, the sort that is much in line with Stalin's definition of negative reciprocity as the attempt to get something for nothing with impunity. Caribbean governments, however, are locked in the reciprocal relations of inequality as they are bound by the process and politics of recognition. However, with cunning attention to the manipulation of the logics inherent in reciprocal relations, scammers deftly maneuver within the already existing and demonstrably durable expectations of non-payment on the part of former colonizers and non-receipt according to the sufferation ethic of poor Jamaicans to profit from the deferral's continued cycle. They do so through the technological and economic registers of the lottery scam that produce a reparative logic that reformulates sites of transgression and the currencies and processes for repayment. The practice as seen through this lens is understood as a form of reparations for the long histories and circuits of colonial and post-colonial inequality. The practice reveals reparations as serving more than a means of recompense withheld by one party and expected by the other. Instead, it becomes an engagement that defines the continued productivity of post-colonial relations. As the efforts of the CRC continued to make reparations a headline media item across the Caribbean, it also became a ready discourse among the crew in their justification of the scam. As it would turn out, their justification through the frame of reparations was bolstered, if not significantly introduced, by the release of reggae artist Vybz Kartel's scamming ballad aptly titled Reparation in 2012. The lyrics of the song were a psalmic extolling of scamming's merits and of the opportunities scamming provides for Jamaica's poor youth, and carefully emphasized the practice's positive attributes, including the lack of violence it produced at the moment. So let's listen to it.
As long as they not buy no gun, not support no war, big up the man them start from near and far. Them call it scam, they call it a reparation. If we get to do it is a star, so them want live like one.
Big up every scammer. We make US dollar. We love the house for your mama. Western Union people see give you more honor. Slash, full stop, comma. If you get to youth for you live like Tony Montana. Presidential like Barack Obama. Fool in a house and plane in a hammer. Who said this scammer them wrong? No. Hungry, poverty, that more rubber. Better them do it than take up the mama. Remember the youth, them not squeeze trigger. I just show them a nigga. Missa, you are the grand minister. College, me want send me sister. You say education are the key. Me a beg you not take me things up.
As long as they not buy no gun, not support no war, big up the man them reparation. Every ghetto youth is a star. So they want live like one.
We just want the youth them. No rap Jamaican. Don't buy gun for kill man. Foreign exchange is good for the country. Franklin, USA, Sterling, England. Every ghetto youth say I live like the big man. Mansion bigger than Hilton, Winter. I know everybody can run like Bolt or sting like me or dance like Dinga. Bamboo, I feel bigger than King Kong. Brains like Radigan, Lincoln. The dash two side like a swing song. That's why me want live long. Missa, you are the Prime Minister. College, me want say the sister. You say education are the key. Me a beg you not take me things out.
As long as them now buy no gun, now support the war. We hope the man them start from near and far. We call it scam, we call it reparation. Every ghetto youth is a star. So them all live like one. As long as them now buy no gun, now support no war. We hope the man them start from near and far. Them call it scam.
The song, which was initially banned, forcefully expresses a critique of the lack of available social and economic support in Jamaica. And to be frank, Vybz Kartel is not the best representative of any kind of moral claim. But anyway, the point is being made. This argument is especially salient for the country's poor youth who are not, as Kartel recognizes, imbued with the sporting and entertaining talents that he, Usain Bolt, or the popular Jamaican dancer Ding Dong possess, abilities that seem to be the only registers of valued Jamaican capability and mechanisms for advancement. Scamming is viewed then, as the song implies, as a justifiable practice given the economic environment. This rationale thereby sets the logical framework for the practice to be interpreted as a legitimate form of reparations, which in this view is determined solely on the merit of need, while giving no account to the history of slavery or colonialism as reparative bases. These are not issues that come up in the song. The claim of reparations then is made more strongly when based upon contemporary conditions, which are more perceptible than the effective moral inheritance of slavery's injury. Kartel's dancehall politics of reparations were endorsed by and admittedly influential for the members of the crew. Those politics held a vernacular power that spoke directly to the ethical positionality formed in their experience of race poverty. They were less concerned with injustices of slavery than with the explicit poverty that they and their community currently endured. The injury was not the theft of life or the burden of forced labor across centuries, but that after all of that, they were still sufferers. What they read across the comparative lots of those like them and of those whose fortunes were distinctly better off, what amounted to disparities of race and nationality, was the real matter in need of repair. For the crew, reparations claims embody a counter discourse that provides the means by which contemporary inequalities are historicized. In response, they shifted their reparative gaze away from the nations from whom CARICOM seeks reparations, former colonizers like Great Britain, and toward what they identify as much closer and relevant contemporary side of inequality, the United States. The move identified for them what Obika Gray has noted as a disjuncture between the miseries and hardships of Jamaicans' lived experience on the island and the imagined experience of participating in the material well-being of America. Compensation, thus, is seen as necessarily coming from the United States, as it has in the contemporary Jamaican imaginary become not only a site which produces notions of mobility and aspiration, but also transgression. Most importantly, by that material well-being, the US holds the desired currencies for repayment. I asked the crew how they squared their scamming as a reparative activity. Their response, at once convenient and compelling, was articulated as a natural moral response to the experience of poverty. I can't feel away or feel sorry when we have so little and them are foreign or in America have so much, and they still want more, Omar noted. The logic was unsurprising, but admittedly I was dubious. But according to Junior, it was simple. It's we who are poor and don't have anything, and it's we that make them have what they have. However, how do we actually account for a historicization that skips across time and geography, transforming Britain's transgression into America's? To understand this genealogy, we must trace the post-colonial custodianship of Jamaican exploitation, which has changed hands over the decades with the reorientation of British Jamaican trade and political relations to that of Jamaica and the United States. Through the transference of that transgression's proprietorship, the scammers in the crew pliantly reason that the US acquired Great Britain's moral debts in a view which conflates race with a shift in geopolitical power and labor relations. Dwayne expressed this belief when he explained that, quote, England used to, but now the US runs Jamaica. The idea of the US running Jamaica was not an abstraction. It forms from real experiences and through what Mimi Scheller calls the grammars of racial difference, encountered with Americans who made up over 60% of the country's tourism market in 2015. In the claim of running Jamaica, Dwayne articulates not just a moral sense of guilt inheritance, but a structural capacity for control by the United States and of that control experienced by Jamaicans. When asked to explicate on this seemingly complicated reading of race and restitution, Omar, with an unironic directness, remarked, "Them are not the same white people, or are they not the same white people?" Thank you for laughing. I thought it was hilarious when I heard that. Yeah. His response, more of a rejoinder than an answer, nonetheless provided critical insight. The reference to them, whose meaning glossed both British and Americans as foreign, evidenced the marked semiotic quality of racial disparity and, accounting for the particular class-based reading of race in Jamaica, the fungibility of whiteness. Propping up his reasoning, white racial identification stands as a moral affordance for the scam's targeting of North Americans. In this conflation, race and whiteness in particular serves as a mode or function of inequality and thus offers a steady marker of blame across its permutations and exchanges. Scammers' reparative claims are made within reconfigured relations of reciprocity, adding heretofore unexpected operations. They complicate the post-colonial cycle of reciprocation by forcibly taking repayment. But their taking does not stop the cycle, but proves it to be a resilient and mutable process that is capable of introducing newer parties into its sequence. In fact, the force of taking amplifies the process by allowing for more pronounced counterclaims, which in reciprocal manner continues onward. Moreover, they are taking from sources connected to the original debtor by a symbolic set of relations. Specifically here illustrates the transferability of debt through whiteness, manipulating the totalizing logic of race that often glosses minority subjects into singular entities. Doing so broadens the ability for claims to be made at a growing scale, charted along the tangled path of relations made through globalization and the compounding of injustices carried forward by neoliberal economic policy. Through a loophole of post-colonial liability, then, scammers are able to sustain a claim on the basis of enduring hardship and the growing cast of participants in its perpetuation, and benefit by hedging their symbolic reparations, right, of actual returns, right, alongside the potential yet unlikely real reparations argued for by groups like the CRC. Within that loophole, they draw on the same logics of deferral to extract value and capital from victims, utilizing a similar mobilization of deferral and debt, as I have discussed, by using tactics to increase the compounding of interest through multiple efforts to force a delay in payments on the part of victims. So to conclude, what we see with scammers' use of a reparations rationale is the mobilization of history to shape opportunities within current configurations of global power. The scam, as articulated through these reparative logics, remedies the injury of the colonial encounter, but also the post-colonial retreading of the sites of inequality and injustice by newer actors like the United States government, its citizens, and corporations. US entities and nationals are understood as having not only inherited but purchased the debts of British colonizers to extract further profit from the lives of Jamaicans. As such, reparations stand as a capacious ethical charge that accounts for growing assertions of injustice across the scales of the individual, the community, and the nation. However, rather than persist in the eschatological deferral of sufferation, scammers like Junior and his crew have seized their share of repayment in the here and now. For Junior and his crew, scamming redresses the restricted social mobility many poor Jamaicans face by serving, to quote Jenna Reutman again, as a means of exercising claims to rights in a situation of dispossession and disempowerment. By scamming, these young men expand beyond the immobility afforded by the currencies of popular Black urban culture that delimit the outer boundaries of opportunity. As scamming makes possible participation in local and global economic and cultural circuits in more meaningful ways than the formal economy makes available. Scamming takes advantage of the apparatuses of globalized liberal capitalism founded upon colonial injustice, seeing them as a resource to be manipulated through a reparative logic. Manipulation becomes feasible through open-ended post-colonial relations that, if recognized accordingly, can expand the delimitations of opportunity by reorganizing the operative and ordering framework of sufferation. Indeed, through the reparative logic by which they seize capital, Junior and crew practice a kind of freedom within prevailing relationships of power. Thank you. We have questions, right?
Yeah, take questions. Also, you can mention that you can make questions from the live stream also.
All right, so if you're on live stream, you have the opportunity to ask questions. How does that work?
Yeah, well, it's-
Can I come up on your iPhone or something?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So is there like a hashtag or something I need to say?
No,
they know what it
just-
is? Okay.
They comment on the
Okay.
live stream, it'll come up on my.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Can you go back to the lyrics?
Sure.
So, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the kind of juxtaposition of scamming against like a war. It seems like what they're saying, like, you know, it seems like there's an implication that there's kind of a
Is
bigger
that the
violence
bomber?
project.
Is that the bomber reference you're talking
Well,
about?
and they're in support of war and killing
Right.
people. I mean,
Right.
So, like, is
Sure.
that like a kind of parallel social movement in the form of reparations that's in the culture there, and this is being held up as a
Well, there's a
humanitarian version?
well, no, not really, right? So I mean, what that references to is that in the especially in the early days of scamming, and so this song comes out around 2012, there was very little indication that scamming was productive of violence in Jamaica. Right? That has changed radically since 2013, when the US government, through the United States Senate Committee on Aging, led by Elizabeth Warren, came down on the Jamaica government to really crack down on scamming. What happened with that is that the entire system of scamming, came under attack, but great attention was paid to the supply of lead lists. So what ended up happening ultimately was that scammers or scamming groups began killing each other for lead lists because of the kind of false scarcity, right, or the enforced scarcity of lead lists. And so when this song comes out, they're saying, look, we're not actually killing anybody. We're just taking money from people who, for whatever reason, are inclined to give it to us. So even if you go back to the Wall Street Journal, where is it? It's the beginning, the Wall Street Journal cycle of scamming. Very seldom was there, at least in the beginning, that there's a rapid move towards threatening victims, right? And I should add that there's actually a fantastically sophisticated intervention of technology at this point, because scammers are getting people's addresses, they're looking them up on Google Maps. So they're saying, well, I know you live near that Dwayne Reed on whatever street, right? So, so when it did come to threats of violence, they were actually rather convincing because they knew that there was a Dwayne Reed on the corner of whatever intersection, right? So going back to the lyrics, this was just a declaration of the fact that no one's really getting hurt, right? And also the Jamaican law at the time, the Proceeds of Crime Act, were relatively responsive to that because you didn't have scammers being jailed, right? What you had was an increased revenue stream for especially local constabulary forces who would go, do a raid on a scammer house, take the computers, take the cash, it would arrest a scammer, but then he'd be out on the street the next day, right? It is, to my mind at least, no coincidence that around the time that scamming was at its apex in Montego Bay, which is a relatively small city of over 100,000 people, you had a Jaguar, Volkswagen, and Audi dealership open, right? I mean, there's a small expat community of American and European workers, but they're not buying so many cars, right? And so there was a sense that, look, this can actually benefit, right? Which is why he's saying, foreign exchange is good for the country. Franklin, USA, Sterling, England, right? He said that we, Western Union should give us more honor because we're actually doing business for Western Union, because that is the mechanism by which all of our scamming revenues are coming into the country. And so this was really, a kind of counterclaim to what we're growing, a growing vocalization of criticisms against scamming, right? And we could talk a little bit about what those critiques were, right? But this in no way was anything about like an integrated war. It's just the general sense of war in Jamaica, like people are warring, like arguing, fighting, that kind of thing. Like no one's in a war, right? Yeah, thank you.
I have a question, a lot of questions. This is really fascinating, but for now, I'm just going to ask two, and they basically have to do with the kind of entree into this business and the outcome of it. So in terms of the entree, I'm really impressed. These must be very good impersonators. They must be good with accents.
Right.
I mean, how do they prepare to get, I guess, the American accents they need to have to do this in impersonate officials? And then my other question on the other end is, so what does the payoff look like for them?
Absolutely.
I mean, are they living large? What?
Absolutely. So the first question being, how do scammers prepare? I mean, and that's, in another part of the project, I spent a lot of time talking about this, and so it's important to know that Montego Bay's economy is largely dominated, has been for nearly a century, if you will, dominated by tourism, and so there's just this regular contact with America and Americana. Furthermore, and this is actually I think a bit more of the realistic answer, is that what you had in Montego Bay developing from roughly the late 1980s were the business processing outsourcing free zone industries, right? And so we have the rapid increase of call center work. And so the fact is that, so you have tourism, right? And so you have young Jamaicans go and do like vocational courses in hotel or hospitality management or so forth, or bartending or whatnot. You then see a shift through the NTA, which is Jamaica's national training agency, of offering of greater courses in call center operations. And so many of these guys, if they don't end up working in call centers, which a couple of the crew did actually work in call centers, they get this call center training, right? Because it's seen as one of the more viable streams of opportunity, although poorly paid. And so there's this, it's no coincidence, right? It's completely unsurprising that they're able to put on accents, right? And what's interesting is that, they completely, adopt or really appropriate all of the kind of call center protocols, right? So if you call one of these guys, what ends up happening is, so the phone comes up, and I didn't at all talk about like the technologies, and we should talk about that, right? So voice over IP technologies, right? Through like devices like the Magic Jack or VoIP apps. You would call, and you would think that they would be pretty inclined to answer straight away. But oftentimes they like hang up, right? Or they don't accept the call because they want you to continue to call. So they know to replicate the kind of frustration that we all experience with call centers when we call somebody and we can't. You know what I mean? So so they'll hang up, and you will get a voicemail, and it says, "Thank you for calling the US Credit Claims Commission. I'm sorry I can't get to you right now, but your call will return in the order in which it was received." It's like an actual voicemail that I would play, but we're being live streamed, right? And so then they call you back, right? And so there's this complete sense about the way that we encounter the call center experience. Importantly as well, and I'll talk about this elsewhere, is that they begin to develop an intimate sense about North Americans' relationship to capital and to credit, right? Because one of the major call centers, well, interestingly, so in Montego Bay, you have this company called ACS, right? And I'm gonna make this joke here too. So if you're NYU PhD students, chances are you don't know ACS because you're well funded, right? So ACS is a student loan processor for the federal government, and once upon a time for Sallie Mae. And so when you would call to like work out something with your student loans, you would end up calling Montego Bay, right? You would call Jamaica, right? Additionally, Amazon has one of their biggest call centers in the Caribbean, in Jamaica. And so there's these regular encounters with just the foolishness, really. Like I paid, my Amazon delivery was supposed to be here by, same day, and 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 so there's a sense in which, building into, so thinking about the earlier quote, right, where, I don't know if I have it, where Omar says, I can't feel away when we have so little and they in America have so much and they still want more. Like that sense is really palpable for them because they talk, right? And they talk to people who talk to Americans, right? About the foolishness, like, whatever hasn't been delivered in 2 days, yet you can't eat, that you're complaining about a delivery not being delivered on time. And so the other question is like, so what did this look like? And at best, right, in terms of revenue, this looked like up to 10,000 US a month, right?
Do you mean per scammer crew or
per crew, right? Per crew, right? And a crew is not really a lot of people. A standard crew could be 2-3 people. I mean, you really could have a scammer, be a kind of like sole agent by themselves, right? It's just about your ability to just like pick up the phone, right? It's just that work. What this looked like in a broader sense, and I talk about this elsewhere, is that what I saw at least was an investment in. I want to be very careful here. I don't want to stereotype, right? But a kind of counter narrative to what are the stereotypical claims of the matrifocal Jamaican family kinship organization, right? Where the partner or the father is often absent or distant at best. What I saw, at least within the crew, where, these men wanted to spend more time with their families, being proud of the fact that they can actually pay school fees for the whole entire year, rather than having to scrape by and find this month's school fees, right? Being able to put their children in Ralph Lauren, right? And being able to buy Capri Sun juice boxes and these small things. So it's very meaningful. Kids being put into swimming lessons and Spanish lessons and these kinds of things. What is interesting is that Dan Rathan, if I could find the clip, I won't trouble this computer, but so Dan Rathan, as well as a correspondent for Anderson Cooper 360, went on the hunt for scammers, and Dan Rathan was really just adorable when he went. I don't know how old Dan Rathan is, but he's in Mobay and he walks up to this guy, so he's doing a ride along with this scammer cop, Kevin something, and Kevin Watson. And so apparently the cop has told him that this guy over there is a scammer. So this guy is coming out of like a little corner shop. Then Dan Rather walks up on, well, I hear you're a scammer, right? And you should look it up. It's not like his Axis. He has his own YouTube channel, Dan Rather, right? Axis News or something like that. And the guy's like, who told you that? You know what I mean? He's like, I'm told that that's your house over there. Like it's a bigger house. It's like a mansion kind of thing. He's like, no, I'm just staying there with a friend. He's like, but look at those sunglasses. Those are really expensive sunglasses, right? Like, as if poor people can't have nice things or Jamaican people can't have nice things. And the guy's like, oh, well, these are my girlfriend's sunglasses. And, he's like, but I understand you've been in trouble with the police. Like, no, it was only for ganja. It's only for weed. You know what I mean? And like these various things. But, there's a sense that, scammers are living opulent lives. The common, media representation, is that these scammers are washing their cars with bottles of Dom Perignon and things like that. And largely that is not true, right? The various scammers that I knew across a few crews in Jamaica were not living this way. They had more meaningful wealth than they ever had in their lives, absolutely. But there wasn't this crazy expenditure. Now, where you had this massive concentration of wealth that resulted in the building of properties, etc., were with people who were the local legalist brokers, right? So these were where, these real sites of extravagant wealth were occurring, right? Because again, these are $5 US per name, right? These, it's a pretty impressive trade, right? And so that's where you have a lot of wealth, in that sense. But, interestingly though, there was, to think about reparations, and I didn't talk about it in today's paper, is that, there's a massive contradiction, which is why I call what the scammers operate within a loophole of liability, right? Is that there is not, the cornerstone, I think, of reparations is this notion of distribution or redistribution, right? And so what we have with scammers' notion of reparations is an entirely individualistic sense of reparations, right? And so what you don't have, right, are scammers saying, actively engaging in networks of reciprocity within their communities. And what's interesting about that is that, the classic criminal in Jamaica is the drug don or the gun don, right, or the don, right, who operates, as a kind of political operative in many ways, right, and in many ways is invested politically in engaging in everyday networks of reciprocity, right, patronage. The scammer, however, is completely removed from those obligations and therefore can function as an individually wealthy person, which actually, to my mind, poses a very interesting problem for claims of reparations, right? Do reparations have to exist at this collective level, right? Is that where reparations actually are meant to exist, right? Which is, I think, one of the kind of, shortcomings of Beckel's argument, right? Is that it lives at this kind of, again, like this macro scale that oftentimes if you go and you talk to people individually, they don't want a technology exchange program. It's like the Black Panther ending. Bring it up. He's going to open a community outreach center. Like, no, you're like, Wakanda, give us money. Anyway, thank you. Maybe you had a question here, Michael.
Yeah, I'm curious about what you think about power relations on the island and among Jamaicans. So I'm curious about what you think about the government's role in this.
Right.
I'm sure you're aware that the Jamaican government has been implementing like all these new surveillance systems. So you have like the ZOSOs, which are effectively zones in which they implement martial law.
Right.
And then, which around the first one was was in St. James, and
Right.
I think it was near Montego Bay. And then you also have the NIDS, the new national identity system, which includes biometric data, including fingerprints and retina scans. So, yeah, I'm curious as to how like the government's role in this has sort of changed and like what is sort of influencing that in terms of.
Sure. And so we know that in Jamaica, especially in places like Kingston, the kind of trend towards securitization and surveillance has been on the uptick for many, many, many years, right? And the thing about lottery scamming is the state of emergency in Montego Bay and in St. James is being directly tied to lottery scamming, right? The argument is that somehow the trade in lottery scamming has somehow merged with the trade in guns, right? All of this is coming together, and I don't really doubt that. I do place the blame at this 2013 mandate by the US government that Jamaica cracked down on lottery scam, right? So we see by 2014, the first Jamaican legalist broker, Sanjay Williams, being extradited to North Dakota to face charges, right? So we're seeing what feels like a parallel of what was happening with Buddha's Coke, right? In Tivoli many years earlier. So one thing that I can say is that companies like Western Union, right, and MoneyGram, during 2012, had to shut down all of their transfer branches due to lottery scamming, right? They had to upgrade their security mechanisms, right? And that was part of, earlier I was saying how there was a local criticism of scamming. It was really disruptive, it was really disruptive for everyday Jamaicans' lives, everyday Jamaicans who relied on remittances. There is, I think, an understandable sense as to why you would want an increase in identification on that basis, right? I think there are perhaps broader questions as to why Jamaica would invest in that, but I would argue that lottery scamming should be seen as a central impetus behind this increase, right? Because what Jamaica does not want to happen, right? Jamaica, which is, I don't have it up here, but the picture, the illustration by Clovis from Observer, is, this white couple coming off of a cruise ship, and it's like, welcome to like Jamaica, US like lottery scamming capital of the world or whatever. Like Jamaica cannot literally afford for the country to become identified it cannot become a Nigeria, right? Like it cannot, right? Like all it has is tourism, right? And so Jamaica has completely, right, invested into the various means by which it can counter this growing narrative, right? And so I think a part of that are parts of the kind of infrastructures around securitization and surveillance, absolutely. And so what we have is Montego Bay surpassing Kingston, you know, as a site of criminality, which is remarkable, right? Which is remarkable. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, you just made me. I think you reminded me that I think the USDEA opened a branch in Jamaica. Is that a
Right.
branch in Jamaica? No, they opened one in Guyana. I think
Right.
Jamaica as well, which is interesting because again, it's about U.S. sovereignty extending to Jamaica
Right.
and about the claims about the U.S. and also like it suggests that there's overlap between the lottery scamming. At least law enforcement authorities perceive an overlap between the lottery scamming and drug game. But as you're talking, it also occurred to me that the amount you say people make per month is kind of similar to some amounts people making drug dealing in the crack cocaine era.
Right.
And it's modest amounts. That's what's interesting about
Right.
it. So like Stephen Levitt and Sudhir Venkatesh's study of drug dealing gangs in Chicago, they said that the average drug dealer like on the corner made like $12 an hour or
Right.
something like that. And then even the sort of head of a kind of sector of the drug dealing gang made at most like $100,000 a year or something, right? So people associate crack cocaine dealing with opulence, but in fact it's much more like a kind of slightly better than minimum wage job for the
Absolutely.
foot soldiers, and then a kind of middle management job for
Sure.
the head of the sector. So I think that's interesting. And there was one more thing related to that. You said a comment about, but yeah, I think it's a very important point.
Yeah, no, I mean, and so like in 2011, right, Lotto scamming brought $300 million US into the Jamaican economy. I mean, I think that year it was about representing like 10% of GDP or something. It was ridiculous. It was absolutely ridiculous, right? I mean, so there's like a development argument that can be made, right? So if you believe in like proper laissez-faire, you know, economics, and here these guys is out there doing their thing, it actually could be really impactful for the Caribbean, right, or for Jamaica.
Yeah, I remember the other thing that.
Okay.
But I think it's important you're saying about, let's say, industry in low income areas,
Right.
that are also highly racially stratified or something. That
Right.
seems like it's true both of like U.S. urban enclaves and also of Jamaica. That's
Right.
interesting. But I saw a Facebook post in September where someone just said casually, you know, drug dealers used to throw block parties for the whole hood, and you scammers haven't done anything all summer. And that was interesting because it wasn't even talking about Jamaican scammers. They're saying that like hustlers in the U.S. today,
Right.
they're not even worthy of the name
Right.
because they're just sort of like they're just like two big hustlers. They're
Right.
not actually thinking about like
Right.
let's do Thanksgiving dinner, let's
Right.
do something for the whole hood. Like, you know? So it's to your point.
No, I mean, and that's exactly. I mean, that's a part of the local criticism as well, right? That it's a completely selfish kind of criminal problem, right? Like we can tolerate, you know, the gun trade, we can tolerate the drug trade, but because of this exact thing, like I know that at least the Don is going to pay part of my school fees. I'm going to get backpacks and these kinds of things. I'm going to get, you know, my Pricks crackers, and you know, like these things are going to get worked out for me because of that relationship. You know, and so, you know, what scamming is, right, is our classic Jamaican idea of journalism, right? And so we think about the journal in Jamaica being, you know, the identified personality of Anansi, the trickster spider, right? And so we go back and we read some of that like classic stuff. We read the Anansi stories, right? There's a complete individualistic sense. It's a complete upending of hierarchies, right? And that's what scamming does, you know, or at least did, still does. I mean, it's certainly petering out, right? And you know, so going back to the, you know, what's significant. So while there is not a great amount of revenue, right, it gets amplified, of course, because of the exchange rate, right? And so if you can bring in, you know, what is, you know, 2,000 US a month, like steady, right? That's very meaningful, right? You're talking about like civil service salaries now at that point, right? And so, you know, there's an amplification in that certainly feels like some of the kind of the US, you know, drug criminal, drug dealer kind of narratives, but it's the exchange rate, right? And so there's a way again in which like these offshore scammers are then benefiting from being within this loophole, right? So in fact, the worse the Jamaican economy does, and the more scammers earn, it's the better for them, right? Because they benefit from the differential. Right? Yeah. Go ahead, Mike.
We have one from.
Oh right! Oh wow! I've never
Yeah.
seen this before.
So he's asking if you can discuss to what extent scammers participate in any kind of legal economy,
Right.
or if they're sort of forced to do something more like a shadow economy, and if you've seen sort of this kind of reparative logic applied to any other kinds of sort of shadow economy.
Sure. Yeah, so the extent to which scammers engage in like a more formal or sanctioned economy practice, I mean, the sense is that amongst the guys that I worked with, it was always understood that this cannot be a long-term thing, right? And so what you had, really from the beginning, in fact, were, I mean, as we see in any kind of illicit trade, there's like, it's not like a front, there's some way in which you begin to actually invest some of the revenue from your illicit activity into legitimate opportunities. So, one guy started a small taxi service. He bought a few cars with his money, started running taxis in Mobile. Another guy started a party promotions company, things like that, right? And so the hope was that in being able to invest enough at the front end of these things, then they could ultimately not have to do this forever. And what was most fascinating for me is that, I didn't talk about it today, was that, the practice represented the durability of the kind of politics of respectability in Jamaica, right? And so we have this whole sense that, especially after Deb Thomas wrote Modern Blackness, right? And especially after all of the work around dancehall, was coming out, Carolyn Cooper, etc., that somehow there was a new ethic, right? There's a new kind of urban Black ethic that somehow is anti-respectability, right? Anti the Creole politics of independence. What these guys were saying is that in fact they wanted to become respectable people, right? They wanted to, they were citing people like, I won't mention them because they're local, Montego Bay business people, but people who, they claim to have, started, in drugs or whatever and gone on to build proper businesses, right? They wanted these kinds of things. They wanted that middle class stability. So that to me was pretty fascinating. So even if if individuals didn't necessarily end up doing respectable business per se, it was still something that they were aspiring towards. And so the other question about reparations being used in other illicit or shadow economies, I think wherever there is the experience of post-colonial Blackness, reparations are going to be there. I mean, so what's fascinating is that, and I've given a version of this talk elsewhere, people immediately want me to think about scammers alongside the 419 scammers in Nigeria, right? But who are more interesting to me are some of the oil pirates in Nigeria, right? Who are tapping the lines of Shell and these big, massive corporations, because there's the same kind of, shifting colonial dynamics in terms of colonial relations and corporations and who were involved, right? And, some of my initial research, what you hear from, these guys, these oil pirates, are that the theft of Shell's oil is reparations, right? But I make even, I think, a more stark claim, which is I think that any kind of illegal act or illicit act is available for a reparative claim. I think, nicking a few candies from the Walgreens, like there's a reparative claim that is easy to be made because there's a way in which Blackness is situated within a really complicated kind of network of injustice. And, we can think about the residuals of repair that are yet in the United States as well. Right? So Jim Crow, we're thinking about, the complete 1964 civil rights to now to President Barack Obama, right? To there not, in fact, being this complete remedying of the injustices that Black people have experienced in the US or across the Americas, leaves available every kind of return to be seen as a reparative return. And I think that's something that we have to kind of accept. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I have a follow-up question for you,
Sure.
because when you talk about reparations, whether for like colonial slavery or Jim Crow, most reasonable people would say that it's certainly available to people who are historically disenfranchised. But it sounds like you're making a stronger argument, which is that you cannot have racial justice without redress or without reparations, that it has to be a part of a kind of project of justice. So if you agree with that, could you just say, elaborate a little more?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because, there is, so the argument that I'm making is that Blackness is the lived embodiment of that debt, right? And you cannot, it's inseparable, right? Blackness is completely configured in this relationship, right? And there is, I mean, and this is just coming from my own position, that there are economic relations inherent in the formation of Black relations. And so there is, again, an economic register that even moves beyond just merely a political argument, right? And so where reparations are thought of as being the redress of, say, political injustice in a sense, right? There's a sense in which we have to fully own up to the fact that this was an economic injustice, right? And so therefore the repair must be done on economic terms. The complication with that is the kind of mutability of Blackness. Does Blackness exist at the collective register or the individual register, or does it operate between, right? And that's why, I would argue that there's a pending impossibility for there to ever be ultimately satisfying outcome, right? What then happens if Beckles is successful and Britain says, here's, I mean, even in a case like Haiti, where we know there's a proper financial account, right, of what was taken, right, what was then asked to be paid by Haiti, if that then comes through this mechanism of development, right, then if you have that one Black dude over there who's still living in some kind of poverty, that claim exists still because of the ways in which Blackness can operate simultaneously operate at collective and individualistic levels. Yeah. You have a question on that?
I'm wondering about whether there were any women in
Yeah.
operations, and also whether there were any gender roles for any support by the women in their homes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the question for those listening on the live stream is that what were the kind of gender relations, or if there were women scammers, and absolutely are women scammers. There weren't any women scammers in the crew that I worked with, right? But absolutely you had women participate in the scam. What was interesting is that you also had children participate in the scam, right? And so in a much bigger discussion around the technologies, right? And the communication technologies, you have one of the primary mobile service providers in Jamaica. They just are offering, $1 a day like tariffs to call the US. And so what you have are young school children that's randomly dialing US phone numbers and trying to scam whomever came up on, you know what I mean? And so you have this, right? There are, my wife actually got a scam phone call from a woman once, and it was fascinating. I'm like, wait, Lee, don't hang up. I'm like, this is research. I'm like, hey, my long-time friend, this is me, so-and-so, Shireen, or whatever. Remember I met you at the Walmart? And I was like, no. But it was an 876 number, right? And so here's where there's something important to consider, is the fact that there are very sophisticated ways of doing the scam. So like the crew who call themselves US Credit Claims Commission, right? They've been able to access what is a 1-800 VoIP number. So you're actually calling what in every regard feels like a legitimate organization. So you have that kind of at the top end, if you will, down to people who are using the local 876 Jamaica area code, right? And interestingly, in the beginning of the scam, that was useful enough because the 876 felt like an 866 or an 800 or an 888. And so, regular folks in the US think that that's a toll-free number. And so it has to be a corporation calling or a company calling. So absolutely, you do have that. And I think, there's a question as to whether the approach has changed. And I would say no, right? I mean, call center work is predominantly occupied, taken up by women in the Caribbean. I mean, yeah, I won't make a larger claim, but certainly in the Caribbean. I mean, this is evidence from even Carla Freeman's work from nearly 20 years ago, right? And so there is a sense that women are in many ways central to the practice, in a variety of ways. Now, as it concerns gender relations, if there's a particular thing that women do or don't do, no, it's, you know, again, there's really a couple of things that can be done, and you know, we know that, you know, oftentimes girlfriends are deployed to go pick up a transfer, and oftentimes that's thought of as being advantageous, right? Certainly, I've just said that women callers are actually, you know, quite common, and in fact quite appropriate in many regards. And so yeah, I don't think there's you know, something I should talk more about, and I do elsewhere in the project, but there's not necessarily a barring or a prohibition on the basis of gender.
Just quickly, I get scam calls like multiple
Yeah.
times a week.
What's interesting is that there's now a new feature, like I have T-Mobile, I don't know what happens up here, and there's like a scam feature that you can actually sign up for. So there's I have a screenshot of it. So like a call will come in and it says scam likely. So the screen actually rather than the number says scam likely anyway.
So this is related to my question, which is I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of industry or industries in this. So you've talked a little bit about telecom, both here and there. If there's anything more you want to say about that, it'd be interesting. But I'm particularly interested in the finance industry, because like Western Union loves this, presumably, right? They're making money hand over fist over these transfers, as are, you know, if they're going to Walgreens and buying, being asked to buy American Express cards or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and so that's like the presumption, right? I mean, that presumption gets read, you know, very clearly by Vybz Kartel in the song, right? You know, but it's about protecting the actual target market, right? So, you know, that there's a general sense that if these companies are complicit in everyday Americans, and they're always grandmas and grandpas in these news reports, it's always, you know, there's something I should say about that as well. But anyway, that if these companies are found to be complicit or ineffective in combating these scams, and elder scams in particular are really like heated like debate, right? Poor old people are always being scammed out of something, right? And so therefore there's not this sense that it's a benefit, right? It's in many ways it's a really small slice of these companies' overall customer base. Right? So who benefited for real though was the Jamaican government, and they were really slow to. You know, scamming was happening from 2007. It's known practice. 2007. It's not until 2013, end of 2013, 2014, that the government begins to come down on it. Right. So actually, right now is when we're seeing, I think, the most activity around, you know, anti-scamming or anti-corruption laws and enforcement, which I think coincide really nicely with this increase in surveillance and securitization.
First of all, this is so fascinating. Thank you so much.
So you come back next week then?
Yes, I'm going to stick with this Michael series.
Good, I've done my job.
So I was really glad to hear you bring up the Nigerian scams, because it was something I was thinking about here. And it makes me wonder about the way these groups might be perceived. I don't know to what extent you pay attention to or follow kind of media depictions of these scammers, you know, in the US. So kind of in a sense, how is white America thinking about that? Because it strikes me that this is a phenomenon that is probably hard for white Americans to make heads or tails of, because these are Black people, ingenious, armed with technology. Right? It's like the Black Panther thing, like it's this mystical kingdom that nobody ever heard of.
Right.
So,
Absolutely.
So I'm really curious. How do they get depicted? I wonder if they get depicted just as sort of criminals, to stick with an old racial stereotype, or if this kind of technological aspect and ingenuity, it somehow, you know, interrupts those stereotypes.
No, I mean, because
the Jamaican scammer in the Wall Street Journal cartoon was white.
he was, because, you know, Black people and computers, you know, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, these depictions completely overlook the technological side, which is so important. Completely, it's just somehow them on a phone. Like the only technology is the phone.
So they're wily but not ingenious.
Right. And so, you know, there is just this really flat narrative, right, about these guys just scamming. You know, it's all about the complex complex lives of, Grandma Edna from like Bismarck, North Dakota, right? And what's so fascinating about that is, what is really being, I think, overlooked are the narratives from these elderly white Americans, because the rationalizations are, Medicaid or Medicare could not cover all of my medication. So this looked like a really good opportunity to actually pay for that. Or my husband has been in bed for the past 6 months because we can't afford the surgery. And so there's a complete, glossing over the fact that these elderly people, they're not stupid, right? I mean, they're not like, oh, this sounds like a really good idea. It's like, well, I'm also on the other end, right? In, kind of material despair in one way or the other, and this looks like an opportunity, and I don't see any opportunity for me. So there's a case of poverty on both sides, in fact, that somehow gets overlooked. The questions of technology don't get discussed. The really sophisticated ways, completely get overlooked, that Jamaicans, look, and here's what we should realize. We know this through Black Twitter, right? Black people completely lead the charge on most technological innovation in terms of from the consumer end, right? And so VoIP, so voice over IP technology, what we call like internet telephony, right? So the thing that runs Skype and FaceTime and these various things, it's what led, Jamaica to, steal the voice competition a few years ago when Jamaica and Tessa and Chin won. It was Jamaicans using VoIP technology in Jamaica calling to vote as if they were American. And she sings well, right? So she deserved to win. But what I'm saying is that the diaspora, right, completely came together, and a large part of that was like the technological, capability of voice over IP that allowed Jamaicans in Jamaica to kind of completely disrupt the kind of normative, geopolitical boundaries, right, and allowances to vote as if they were Americans, right? So there's a real question of breach here that I think, with some sophistication can be really, really revealing, I think. Yeah.
One last,
So I just was curious about like this idea of this transfer between the UK and the US in terms of like colonial responsibility and how that relates to sort of the US, how the US exists in Jamaica's imagination, sort of like as a migration destination, as a place to sort of
find opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm just sort of trying to like figure out how those things relate and like.
Yeah, and I am as well, right? So with the claim that they're the same white people, I was like, wait, that doesn't really hold out. How does that actually work? But what you begin to appreciate are some of the more fine, nuanced ways in which, especially through policy, but also through media portrayal, I'm talking about over, decades, right? I'm talking about, from the majority of Caribbean people, Jamaicans in particular, going to Great Britain in the 1950s, 1960s, to a really radical shift from the 1970s onwards towards North America. There is a complete sense that there is a relationship of mobility, right? So there's this one thing, right? So we can go. One of my colleagues at UC Berkeley, Nadia Ellis in English, talks about the kind of queer notion of diaspora, where like in the Caribbean, there's always an elsewhere, right? Drawing on Muñoz's work, right? There's always an elsewhere, and so understanding what it is to be Jamaican is also to understand oneself in relationship to other places. And so that is a stable thing that does not get disrupted. Now, what defines that elsewhere is a whole other question, and a lot of that's to do with opportunity, sure, but also the increasing building of community as migration patterns shift. So what we know from an obvious standpoint is that the more you move to a place is the more you begin to familiarize yourself with the place, the more you begin to get brought into the kind of operative logics of that place, and you find yourself at the receiving end of injustice, right? And so we begin to see Jamaicans in many ways throughout Obama's presidency become harshly critical of Jamaica because of Obama's really, strong policy of deportation, you know, and a lot of Jamaicans get swept up in what were Obama's deportation policies, right? Additionally, there's this, you know, an everyday sense as to, you know, this happens in the media, as to the way in which the, you know, Jamaica being, you know, a pawn from Cold War era becomes intimately tied into American politics, right? And there's a way in which that gets, you know, understood on an everyday level, right? I mean, we can even say, well, why hasn't Jamaica had, you know, a legalized marijuana industry for decades? Everybody, I can't walk on the street without somebody talking to me about weed or something, right? And so Jamaicans are all about weed. How come we can't? Well, we know that America, right? The United States, in many ways, has blocked that possible legislation, right? And so there's a sense in which, you know, Jamaica is run by the United States, and that's that fact. Now, you know, there's an interesting sleight of hand, I think, that happens, right? When we begin to think about reparations. But the claims of reparations, as I said in the paper, are contemporary, are based upon contemporary circumstances. There is not the sense of, oh, well, there's slavery particularly at the center of this claim, right? There is a part of that which comes in from, I know that my current circumstance, right, as a sufferer or a sufferation, as it were, emerges out of a particular moment, but I'm experiencing this right now. And so who then can I blame right now? And so there's this way in which it comes in at both angles, right? And what that then means, though, is that the British are then joined by the United States in this kind of this reciprocal relationship, right? And so what that means is that the chances for reparations are actually decreased, right? Because now we have Jamaica committing, say, certain crimes against Great Britain, but also Jamaica committing crimes against the United States. And so when we think about long-term exchange of reciprocity, which, you know, I don't know if you have time to talk about, but maybe not. No one asked me a question about reciprocity, that's fine. Yeah, no. But, you know, that then becomes something, right? And so the United States and whiteness as representative of Americanness, right, gets pulled into that equation. And it's about lived experience in places like here in New York or in Miami, right? Or, you know, Hartford, Connecticut, right? Yeah.
So, thank you, David.
All right.
And do you want to announce that?
Yes, sir.